Welcome back, everybody. This is my second SGC reveal. This is also the second order I submitted at the National that concluded last month. I'm going to do something a little different with this video. I'm going to actually take the time to tell you about the card, where I got the card, why I got that graded, and how it fits into my collection. So I kind of hope you enjoy this reveal, as it's going to be a little bit more drawn out, but hopefully it'll be a little bit more meaningful and entertaining for the viewer. The first two cards I'm going to show you fit into my collection because they are actually cards from the 1953 Bowman Color set. As I've mentioned in previous videos, this is a set I'm currently working on, and I'm just over half of the set at this time. I picked these two particular cards because I wanted to get a couple of these Hall of Fame players encased, and at some point I think I want to be able to actually take the Hall of Fame players and managers from this set and get them all graded at some point. So I had two that I selected that I thought were in better shape, and those are the ones I had in this order and want to share with you now. First one being, and this one is the only one I think I was really kind of disappointed with the grade when it came back, and sorry about the glare, you can actually see my face in there, is the Eddie Matthews. It came back as authentic, minimum size not met. Didn't necessarily say evidence of trimming, but it could possibly have been that, or just a manufacturer error where they felt it could have been a bigger card, and it wasn't for the purposes of grading. So this one was just a little bit of a disappointment. I picked this one up at the Chicago Sports Spectacular back in this past spring, I believe. I bought a bunch of cards from the seller, some of which are actually in this order. And this is the only one I think that came back with like sort of more or less a kind of a disappointing grade, but I'm still happy to have this card encased. And I think it'll go nicely with the cards we already have kind of featured in the background here, where we have cards from the 1953 Bowman set. So I'm going to go ahead and put my boy Nellie Fox down. I'm going to put Eddie Matthews next to Stan the Man here in the corner, which kind of fits out the nice little run of Tuck's cards there. The second one was a card I picked up Mother's Day 2 years ago. So back in 2022, I went to a card show that actually occurred on Mother's Day here in the Schaumburg area, just outside of Chicago. And I went to a dealer that I worked with for the first time, and I've actually gone on to buy several things from the past, and actually have been able to talk to him a few times outside of shows, and just a genuine individual and a really nice guy to be able to do business with. Well, anyway, my first transaction with him involved two cards, and this was one of them that was in it. And he was able to, eventually we were able to come to terms because he really wanted to make sure I kind of went home with a card that day, and that was actually the Whitey Ford. When I picked up the Whitey Ford, I was really excited initially at the card, even though obviously you can see it's off center pretty significantly. That's really a draw that takes away from the card, but something that does bring you in is just how white and crisp the borders and corners are on this card, as well as the color on there. I wasn't sure how this one might grade out because there is a small crease on the card that probably is no longer visible because it's encased, but I knew it when I submitted it, so I thought it might come back like a 1. I wasn't sure how SGC would eventually grade this card. The crease is very small, and it's like a hairline crease that's in the background of the card here, where you really can't see it on camera, and it was actually hard to pick up in the naked eye in that showroom that day when I purchased this card. But I am actually just really thrilled that the Whitey Ford came back as a 3, as it's probably one of the more iconic cards from the set, and one that's fairly desirable and collectible for an early Whitey Ford card. So these were the first two that I had, and as you can see, it kind of fit into my theme of trying to be able to get the cards that are Hall of Fame players graded from the 1953 Bowman set as I continue to complete it. Staying with the theme of set collecting, I've also mentioned that I'm working on the 1948 Bowman set, which was an all black and white set, and it was the first major issue release after the end of World War II in 1948. Before you are the 3 cards that I have of Hall of Famers that are already encased, one of which is an authentic card of Enos Slaughter, whereas the other 2 are graded, which is the Warren Spahn rookie on my right, and obviously my favorite Bob Feller card, which is here on my left. All of which ones I picked up this year, except for the Slaughter. I had purchased these cards that I'm going to show you here at the last 2 Chicago Spectaculars. One was in November, right before Thanksgiving, and the other one was in March. And I submitted these 2 guys in for grading, to be able to add to the theme of having the Hall of Fame players graded, not just for the 53 Bowman set, but also for the 1948 Bowman set. Now there's only 9 total that are going to be Hall of Famers in the set, so I'm actually making quite a bit of progress here when I actually am able to add these 2 into the collection and show you the next 5. So let's start with the one I picked up right before Thanksgiving, and that's going to be the Ralph Kiner card, which is card number 3 in this set. And I'm sorry again about the glare. When I bought this card at the time, it was fully disclosed by the dealer that actually there was something wrong with the way it was cut at the factory. Now, they kind of say that there's evidence of trimming, but in truth, the card actually, they cut it incorrectly. There's actually more cardboard on this card than there actually should be, as this corner actually juts out quite significantly, whereas this one has more of like what you'd expect to be the traditional corner. So something kind of happened funny when they were actually producing this card, and it got cut and then later packaged into wax packs that were later then distributed and purchased by children, likely at that time. But this card was one that was miscut, in my opinion, from the factory itself, even though they say that there's evidence potentially of trimming, and maybe possible, maybe they tried to kind of correct that a little bit on the corner here, possibly. But it was fully disclosed at the time, and I was comfortable with that because the registration on the card is fantastic. The black and white image is very clear. There's not really any wear and tear on the image itself. The back is very clear and able to read. Otherwise, you know, it's just a pretty fantastic example of the Ralph Kiner rookie card. Always liked about this card is they kind of refer to him as like maybe the next calling of Babe Ruth in the game, because he had such a great start to his career and then kind of later drifted off a bit in his 30s. He started to leave Pittsburgh and kind of then get cycled through Chicago and Cleveland. So that was the first card I got here, was the Ralph Kiner that I picked up again in last November from the Chicago Sports Spectacular. And then the one in March that I attended right around St. Patrick's Day, actually, I was able to go to the same dealer where I got that Eddie Matthews card, and I was able to buy some more Bowmans I needed for this set. And within that order, the ungraded card was actually the Johnny Mize. The Johnny Mize card is not a super high value card, so I was able to get it at a reasonable price. I think I paid maybe like $40 for it. This I think is a good example of potentially why people still like want to get things graded, because I think on a resale market I actually would have made my money back if I chose to do it. But all these cards are actually going to go in my personal collection. They have some personal meaning to me as a result of it. So the Johnny Mize card here, pictured here with the New York Giants. I was kind of surprised with the grade. I mean, the centering I thought was really good. The corners and edges had a little bit of wear, but there was some staining on the card itself. Probably dirt it's picked up over time, so I was actually kind of surprised it came back a 4.5, and actually was really thrilled to be able to add that one into my collection. And so now here are the 5 Hall of Famers I have at this point. As you can see, if I could get them all in frame here, it might be a little more difficult unless I move the SGC hat, which I think I will do. And then we can put Kiner over here in the corner, and we can put Mize off here in the corner. So there's 4 more to get. I know I need to get the Red Shandies, the Yogi Berra, the Stan Musial, and then obviously the Phil Rizzuto. So I'm looking forward to be able to add those into my collection. I'm going to ask the Bob Feller card to actually step up here for a moment. Again, as I mentioned before, and I've done a video on this card, this is my favorite Bob Feller of any of the cards I have in my Bob Feller collection, which is growing at this point, and it's my favorite card within this set as a result of it. I brought this up because actually back in May, at the end of May, I think it may even be the beginning of June, I purchased an autograph of Bob Feller, and it was an autograph from the 2001 Bowman Heritage set, which was the first time they did the Heritage set for Bowman, also the first year they did Heritage for Topps. And I actually learned later there was only 2 Hall of Famers that actually signed cards in this set at that time, Bob Feller being one of them and Warren Spahn being the other. So I wanted to get this card encased, and with SGC, for the grade, if the autograph is of quality enough where they believe it's a 10 quality grade, they actually will assign a grade to it as well. So this one I was really thrilled that they got not only graded the card, but they also graded the autograph and came back a 10. So I just think that these really are great cards to have side by side in my collection kind of going forward, as they just are. For me, they mean a lot, just kind of being able to have an autograph of like one of the all-time great right-handed pitchers in history. And then obviously this kind of spans the era of like being able to talk about having the first produced set that came after World War II, and he's also featured in sets prior to World War II, but then he also was in a set that was kind of a retro set that's become a theme within the hobby that started at the beginning of this century. I think it's just fantastic. So those are my Bowmans. Actually wanted to keep the heater from the meter up here one last time because I'm not quite done yet talking about Bob Feller. As you can see, I added one other card into this picture here that you had not seen, which was the 1954 Bowman Bob Feller, which at this point is still my only graded card from the 1954 Bowman set, and was my very first Bob Feller that I picked up years ago at a Chicago Sports Spectacular. So I actually picked up a card. This next card I actually picked up when I was on a trip with my family. We were taking our nephews up to Lambeau Field because one of my nephews is a huge Green Bay Packer fan. So we were actually wanted to make that travel and do the tour. While we were there, we actually stopped in a card shop, and it was a great old-time card shop that had that old card shop smell, that old stale bubble gum that you can imagine, and cards were just kind of strewn randomly into certain boxes, so there's a lot of treasures to be able to dig out and find. Well, one of the ones I picked out at that time was the 1955 Bowman Bob Feller. And it was a card that I think at some point I thought, like, well, you know, I don't think it's one I'll probably go ahead and get graded at some point, but it's still a great card to have because there's a little bit of paper loss here. But as I was looking at some grades for these cards in the past, I noticed that the graders, especially at SGC, seem to be a little bit more understanding if the borders were a little bit worn and dinged up on these cards from 1955. And I'd only had one other graded card from 1955, but I wanted to be able to this point maybe throw this Bob Feller in here for two reasons. One, I'm starting to get a little bit of a growing collection of Bob Feller cards, as you can kind of see behind this one. But also it was a memory. You know, I'll always remember that this was the trip where we picked up this card. There was a couple other cards I picked up at that time too, and maybe I'll at some point want to get those in case. But for me, this was the big one because I didn't have this Bob Feller before, and he's actually a pitcher that I really kind of admired. And you know, I was able to luckily pick it up at a price I was comfortable with, in addition to the other ones I purchased that day. But I'll always remember being with my nephews that day, kind of searching through boxes where they're looking for old comics and cards themselves, and I was able to kind of locate these great vintage cards, and Bob Feller being really the jewel of the pickup that day, which goes really nicely in with the Bob Feller collection you can see growing behind you as of this time. Now I'm going to go through kind of a list of cards that don't necessarily fit into any set projects that I'm working on, or even maybe emerging player collections, but are cards that I picked up because they come from iconic sets or featured iconic players. My 1952 Topps Enos Slaughter at this point was the only graded card, Hall of Famer, that I had for the 1952 Topps set. Obviously a Topps set that's iconic for its high series Hall of Famers, obviously capped off by Mickey Mantle. So when I actually was at a card show earlier this year, I was able to, in Schaumburg, I was able to purchase a couple of 52 Topps cards, 2 Hall of Famers and 1 non-Hall of Famer. I actually submitted 2 of the 3 in for this grading order with the intent of actually starting to grow the collection of 1952 Topps cards. So I'll put Enos Slaughter off in the background, and actually will pull out the ones, kind of start showing you the ones I picked up. So the first one I picked up, or the first one I actually went ahead and got graded is not a Hall of Famer, but he's an all-time great red, and you can hard time being able to tell the story of the 1950s without telling about Ted Kluszewski. And obviously he played a prominent role when he came over to the White Sox and played with them in 1959 when they won the pennant. So I was able to get this card, which was a red back of Ted Kluszewski at that time, but I thought about wanting to maybe get that graded at some point, just because I thought it was kind of a nice card, and just because the big players in 1952 are really just kind of iconic images, I wanted to be able to maybe have that in case for my collection ongoing. And the second one is a player we featured already when I looked at the 1948 Bowman set, but this is one from 1952. And it's probably one that I thought is one of the more beautiful cards from this set, is the big old Johnny Mize card. So the big cat here, he's kind of stuck there for a minute. As you can see, is pictured here with the Yankee Stadium clearly in the background. He's holding, like, I think 4 bats in his big old arms at this point. At this point, he was near the end of his career and didn't have quite the dominance that he once did at a previous era when he was a dominant player with the Cardinals and Giants much earlier on in the 1930s and 40s, but he was still a very effective player as a bench player for the New York Yankees and helped them win some more championships during that time. And here he is kind of pictured, and probably just taking a photo while he was kind of getting ready for batting practice, holding 4 bats. and then obviously they turned that into a wonderful colorized image here for the 1952 top set. And again, for me, it's one of the more beautiful cards from the set. As you can see, lovely Yankee Stadium there in the background, clearly capturing the beautiful stadium at that time with the blue sky in the background and the wonderful Yankee pinstripes and the blue hat that are iconic to this day and synonymous with the game of baseball. This next card is a card from the 1953 top set. It was a card that I purchased again at the Chicago Sports Spectacular, the one that was right before Thanksgiving this past year. I picked up this card, actually the next two cards from the same dealer who had them in a stack of ungraded cards. And as I looked through them, I thought that they were really good looking cards and they were good at the prices that I wanted to be able to pick up. Maybe at that time not envisioning I would go ahead and potentially have them graded, but at some point, I'm like, along the road, I'm like, at some point, if I actually go ahead and start grading cards, these will be nominations for them to be one of my early submissions, and in fact, they ended up being that. So the 1953 top set is one I think at some point I want to be able to try and complete, especially after I do the 53 Bowman color. I feel if I go ahead and complete the 1953 top set and maybe even the black and white set for Bowman, that just kind of captures the whole year of baseball cards at that point and tells the story of the full season, because even at this point there was starting to be that divide where you had some players that were featured in one set and not the other. The cards you see before here are all players that were actually featured in both sets, with Johnny Mize being in the black and white set and not the color set, but Eddie Matthews obviously being featured in both sets, as well as Roy Campanella. Staying kind of with the theme of Yankees and also with catchers, the card I went ahead and had graded in this order is probably the one I'm most happy with, even though I think I did save the one at the end where I was actually most thrilled with the grade I received. But the one I was like probably most happy to be able to see it kind of come back, not only just obviously as authentic, but also getting a really good grade, was the Yogi Berra card. This is one I inspected quite a bit just to make sure that I had no questions of its authenticity, but you just never know until you really start submitting cards and get a second opinion, you know for sure. So this was a good exercise for me, being able to do that, and I was very thrilled being able to add this Yogi Berra into my collection from obviously the iconic 1953 top set, but also very iconic picture and image of Yogi Berra. I think one that people are often turning to in the hobby if they're trying to kind of nail down like what is an affordable Yogi card that I can pick up, that's something within my budget that's somewhat affordable. It may only cost me a few $100s, that could be graded. It's this Yogi Berra card. Is well, definitely one that short list, and I'm very thrilled to be able to kind of add that into my collection. And obviously we now have a collection of the two best catchers of that era, where we got Campanella and Berra side by side. It's hard to again talk about baseball in the 1950s in New York without mentioning these two names. And obviously when you talk about Yogi, it's kind of hard to talk about the greatest catchers of all time without bringing up his name at some point, along with Johnny Bench and Josh Gibson. I didn't submit any 64 Giants into this order, but I do have one featured here in the background, which is one I picked up recently at the National Sports Card Convention here in Chicago, which was the Harmon Killebrew. So the Harmon Killebrew obviously was a great player, synonymous with the Minnesota Twins, but began his career in Washington with the Senators before they moved to Minnesota in 1961. Before obviously they issued the next edition of the Senators for Washington thereafter. And we talked about Harmon before being a player that was scouted and recruited by a player that's within the Diamond Star sets. If you want to go back and look at one of those episodes to kind of see who was featured and did that, I believe it was Ossie Bolgi was the one who did that. But this other card was picked up from the same dealer, and I saw it at a price I just couldn't turn it down. I didn't have any cards that were graded, let alone Hall of Fame cards from the 1955 top set, I believe, at that time, until I picked up this card. And it was the Harmon Killebrew rookie card, which is one of the three big rookie cards of that set. This one obviously pales in comparison in popularity to the other two, which would be Clemente and Koufax. But really, on some level, probably shouldn't. And if you think of those two players in particular, obviously they're kind of like icons and gods within the game of baseball, when maybe Killebrew didn't quite reach that standard. Killebrew obviously led the Minnesota Twins for many, many years, and obviously as they begin to develop as a team in the 1960s, they were able to add players like Carew and Oliva and Jim Cotton to their team, and really became a team that consistently competed for the pennant each and every year. Killebrew eventually did win an MVP award later on in his career before he started to wind down in the early 70s. This card, when I picked it up, I knew at the time there was a little bit of a crease on there, but I thought it was a great price I couldn't turn down. I think I picked it up for less than $70 at the time. If I wanted to even get like a graded 1, it was going to cost me over $100, and I just thought that was a little bit silly because a lot of the ones looked bad, whereas this one has really good color and registration on it, but there is a crease in there, and it's a little bit off center, top to bottom, and so you have to kind of and I think top to bottom in particular, so you have to kind of take that into account. So I knew it wasn't going to grade very high, but I knew it would look better than a lot of the ones that I saw at the show that day. I didn't go into the show wanting to purchase this card, but when I saw it in combination with being able to pick up the Yogi Bear, I couldn't turn it down. I couldn't be more pleased to now have it encased, even if it only came back as the 2. This next card I'm going to show you actually helps kind of complete a project I was working on, at least with this player in particular, where I wanted to be able to get his original Gowdy card, which was a rookie card for him in 1934, and then his last playing days card, which was the 1950 Bowman. I believe he might be the only player that was an active player that had a card featured in both of these sets. There are players that were active during the Gowdy sets of the 30s and later were produced as managers later on, or coaches in the 1950s and 60s. But Luke Appling, I think, may have been one that was still an active player across both. But Luke Appling was one where I wanted to be able to pick up a signature of his at some point. And I was able to find this at a card show here in Schaumburg, where they had a Luke Appling cut signature. These were common cards that they did in Upper Deck in the early 2000s. And this was numbered out of 92, or it was SP Upper Deck Legendary Cuts. And you can see actually part of his uniform there, kind of still under there. So it was obviously an autographed photo of Luke Appling. This one I was a little disappointed that they didn't grade the signature on there, so they must not have thought it actually would reach a 10. And because it is a thicker card, I wasn't quite sure how the card itself would grade, so I think an 8 is okay. I'm just happy to be able to have this one in case, so it kind of can join the Luke Appling collection over here, and obviously my growing collection of White Sox Hall of Fame signatures. Staying with the theme of all-time great White Sox, in the background here you have autographs from Billy Pierce from his 1951 Bowman card, which is also his rookie, to Minnie Minoso when he briefly played for the St. Louis Cardinals in 1963, along with the Luke Appling I just showed you. But there was another player that I wanted to have his autograph in case that I picked up also at the same card show in Schaumburg. Actually, I think on the same day, if I'm not mistaken, this actually was the Jim Thome card. This is from 2007 Upper Deck Premiere. The Jim Thome card, numbered out of 50, is obviously one of my favorite players that played for the White Sox during that time. I think he only played for us for 3 brief seasons, but he had a lot of memories, hitting some career milestones, and even being able to hit a very famous home run in White Sox history that actually helped them in a 1-game playoff to actually make the playoffs in 2008, even though they did not advance beyond the first round when they lost to Tampa. So Jim Thome is actually from the same town where I was born. So we were both born in Peoria, Illinois, and I know he's a player that still has a lot of ties here in the Chicagoland area as well as Illinois. He actually lives not far from me, even though I don't know him personally, in a nearby suburb just outside of Chicago. And just one of the great all-time guys in the game too. And I think a player that if we didn't have the players that were tainted by the steroid era, I think we probably would have spent a little bit more time focusing on somebody hitting over 600 home runs like Jim Thome did during the time that he played. And now my final addition to my collection, my graded card collection, is a card I picked up earlier this year. Often when I go to the Schaumburg show, it's a show that doesn't have a ton of guys that are selling vintage cards, and if they do, they have a few here and there that they probably picked up in a collection along the way. Typically more of a modern focused dealer, and sometimes they'll have vintage cards out there, and potentially you might be able to strike a good deal because they don't often know a lot about them, and they just kind of want to offload them, especially if they aren't big names. So I kind of consider finding those like the diamonds in the rough, and sometimes, and I was able to pick up some commons from 52 tops and 53 tops and things like that by doing so. But there was this one card back in, I think, January. I went to the actual card show that kind of stood out to me, and actually I think is going to be the beginning of a future project for me. Up to this point, I really didn't have many cards, tobacco cards from the turn of last century. In fact, you're kind of looking at those right now. I had a couple tobacco cards from cigarette packs, and then I had these big Mecca double folders here in the background. The only Hall of Famers I have were the double folders, meaning the Walsh, which is one I've shown very often, and obviously the Bobby Wallace being the other one who's actually pictured on the back of the card. He's not even actually not pictured on the front. But this card kind of stood out to me because it was from the T206 set from 1909, and it looked like it was in really good condition, but he also was a Chicago White Sox player. So let me go ahead and put here there, Freddie Parent was the card that I saw here, and a beautiful, turned out to be an SGC 3, which I'm totally thrilled about because this card is like well over 100 years old, and I was just fortunate enough to find one that had really good registration, good corners, and very, very, very small creases on it. And I was very optimistic that it might end up grading okay, but you just never knew. I never knew if maybe it got touched up here or there, so it might have just came back as authentic. So for it to come back a 3 is fantastic. Freddie Parent himself was a player that played predominantly with the Boston Red Sox in his career, was featured actually with the team during the initial World Series in 1903, and later played for the White Sox as he kind of finished up his career before he then became involved with the minor league team, which was settled in Baltimore. And at that time, he actually joined the team at the time when a young pitcher who actually had a pretty good bat too, was just beginning to start his minor league career and was later then purchased by the Boston Red Sox, due in some part because of Freddie Parent's relationship with his old parent club, was kind of recommending that they go ahead and pick up this young left-handed pitcher who also could hit pretty good, and his name was George Herman Ruth. So Freddie Parent obviously had a tie-in with Babe Ruth becoming a player with the Boston Red Sox at some point back in history. Freddie Parent actually lived to be quite old. He was, at the time of his death, he was the last surviving member, not only of the Boston Americans, who later became the Red Sox, but of anybody that played the 1903 World Series. So imagine the stories he had to tell about old-time baseball to whoever would listen, all the way up to the point of his passing in the early 70s. So that is it, everybody. I hope you really enjoyed the graded cards that I did, and the reasons why I wanted to get these graded, and the stories behind them. I hope you guys have a great remainder of your weekend, and I will see you all soon.